everybody. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this esteemed panel. Who we have right here is we've got three people who sit at the center of policy reform and policy determination. I'd like to introduce them. We've got first Ms. Fundi Chazibana, who is the Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. We've got Astrid Luden, who is the Deputy Commissioner of the FSCA, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, and Rudy Dix, who is the Head of Project Management at the Office of the Presidency. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, capital markets sit at the heart of economic growth. They allocate capital, they price risks, and also transmit policy. But they're also under pressure from uncertainty from a macro perspective, rapid financial innovation, and from growing expectations around safety, fairness, transparency, as well as the progress of structural reforms. Today, we're going to explore the intersection between multiple policy domains that shape how capital markets function, and namely they are macro policy, prudential supervision, conduct regulation, and structural reforms. And what I hope you'll get out of this panel is really a sense of how these domains work together in response to the market pressures, with a bid to strengthen economic resilience as well as enhance our investor confidence. So I'll start with you, Fundi, and say that the capital markets of today was designed for a very different economic and technological era. So in your view, what do you see as the biggest mismatch between today's prudential policy as together with how capital markets have evolved?
Thanks, Fuyo, and it's great to be here, and it's also great to follow Kathy because she said a lot of what I had planned to say. I would say if we look at capital markets today, they were designed at a time in which we had probably less volatility, right? So if we think about the conjuncture, about the interface between geopolitical sentiments and how market rules were set up. So we came from a world in which financial integration at a global level was priced, and that was happening in the space of capital markets, and it was also happening in the real economy in terms of how value chains were being set up. And we came from a world in which we were very rules-based focused. And that dispensation informed basically how the rules and the expectations around capital markets were set up, and that's how we were all playing. And equity markets are the place in which the macroeconomic and microeconomic elements interface. They're also the place in which elements of what is happening in the local jurisdictions, regionally and globally also interface. And I would say in terms of where the mismatch is happening, is there are changes that are being driven by geopolitics a lot more. So being adaptive in that environment is something that we've got to think about. But the pace of innovation, which Kathy touched on, is also yet another area. So when we talk about the macro financial elements, my work will be made easy because the securities supervisor is right next to me. So she's going to talk about that. Is that at a macro financial level in South Africa, we still have rules around the capital flows management framework that requires a lot more permissioning in a world in which the flow of cash can be a lot faster, in a world in which there are innovations that are allowing alternative forms of payments and settlements. So that is the one mismatch we have to talk about. The second area that we've got to talk about is the speed with which liquidity conditions can change in capital markets. And that is an area that's very important from a stability point of view that we've got to think about as a central bank. So with more innovation, you can have fast movement, fast drying up of liquidity conditions, which means you need to have a regulatory framework or a capital management framework that is designed to augment and adjust for these varying liquidity conditions. I would say those are the main issues that I want to highlight right now for you, but to also say that the macros have become a lot more important right now, and also these structural elements that that Kathy was talking about in terms of what does resilience look like in this current framework, what does credibility look like in this current conjuncture. So we learned a few things during COVID around the importance of price discovery and the stopgap measures that a central bank has to have in place to enable that to happen, and what to do when you don't have full-on price discovery in the event of dysfunction and fast response times. So let me stop there.
Sounds like you've got a lot to do in order to address those mismatches. So where do you start? What is a priority that you would focus on?
So where we are starting as a central bank is, again, we have this platform that we have with all of the economic regulators and the supervisors. So we've got the Financial Sector Oversight Committee, in which the FSCA sits, in which the South African Reserve Bank is there, the Prudential Authority, and the National Treasury. That is the interface where we compare notes around what do we see in the conjuncture and where are the bottlenecks. Secondly, there are a number of announcements that the National Treasury will be making shortly as well. We are in the budget blockout period, so I can't talk about certain things more freely around amendments and augmentations to the capital flow management framework, which is going to assist with these flows of capital. But you need to have a combination of what we call macro financial augmentations, and then these other structural reforms that Rudy is going to talk about to complement, because money is coming into an environment in which you are investing in the real economy. So you're not just investing in the financial sector. So there has to be complementarity between the regulatory environment, between what is happening in the real economy, and then also the stopgap measures as well.
Yes, what's very encouraging is you're talking about working together with Treasury, FSCA, as well as the Office of the Presidency to have a coordinated response. Astrid, from your side, what are the mismatches you're seeing between the Conduct Authority and how the capital markets have evolved?
Good morning, for you. So I think Catherine actually touched on most of the things, and there's probably very little for me to say, so I'm going to just re-emphasize some of the things she's already said. So, capital markets today are, as we all know, mostly digital. They are very fast-moving and increasingly borderless, but our regulatory frameworks and our supervisory approaches are really built for slower, more intermediated markets. So I think the mismatch, the biggest mismatch is probably both on the supervisory and the regulatory space, is that it's still very much focused on sort of siloed institutions versus what we're seeing, which are markets that are characterized by platforms, data-driven trading, and of course cross-venue activity. So there's a need to modernize the regulatory framework, and there are two main components that are underway. The first one is the Conduct of Financial Institutions Bill, which hopefully will be tabled in Parliament this year. And the other one is, which has already been in the process, I think, for 10 years, and unfortunately is not concluded yet, is the review of the Financial Markets Act. So those two regulatory pieces, I think, are necessary. So what the COFI legislation will do will introduce activity-based regulation and supervision, and I think that's a critical component. So as the FSCA, what we're doing is preparing for that. We're reviewing our licensing model, our risk model, we're going to be issuing licenses, a single license for an institution with different activities. And that, of course, requires us to work differently as an organization, but also to change our systems. So from the FSCA, what you can expect in future is activity-based and technology-enabled supervision. We're strengthening our capacity around technology, understanding technology, and also being able to supervise it. And of course, cross-border coordination is critical. And for that, we work very closely with international supervisors through IOSCO.
Wonderful. So moving from products and disclosures to more platforms, as well as how people actually behave. Rudy, our rose today. Operation Vulindlela
with lots of thorns.
Operation Vulindlela is underway, and I'm just interested to find out, how is it addressing some of the biggest shifts in capital markets?
Yeah. I mean, there are two things that I think are important for us to consider. Number one, I think what we've done over the last few years is provide a degree of policy certainty, which is quite important for flow of capital and for investment decisions to make. Because uncertainty, of course, breeds a level of risk appetite that costs capital and that costs us as a society if we're borrowing from a sovereign point of view. So I think policy certainty has been an important part, and the reforms have provided that level of policy certainty. I don't even notice, I think we have less sort of policy statements that are made that are divergent, and I think that consistency in working together across government with a very strong presence in coordinating that and across different institutions, SARB, for example, National Treasury, and many others, is quite an important. And it's paid off, by the way. So, theoretically, sometimes we say this, that, if you create policy certainty, maybe things happen, but it's paid off because credit rating agencies, FATA, for example, also, has reduced cost of capital by creating that level of certainty. I think the second thing, which is quite dynamic, is that it's the crowding out effect, right? Because, of course, our debt to GDP has significantly increased, but it's stabilized, right? And so 2 years of primary budget surpluses. And what you've seen is a changing dynamic where I think capital markets are shifting more and more to the opportunities created by the reform to private sector. So generally what would have happened if we did some of the reforms and the big capex spend on energy generation, right? Where we've opened up for private sector, or now that we open up for logistics, we would have funded largely, or you would have funded largely SOEs, and that's underwritten by the sovereign treasury, and so of course debt would rise. But what's nice about this is that firstly it shares the risk, right? It takes away the risk from the sovereign because you're putting that risk onto the private sector that sees an opportunity based on policy certainty to invest into markets that generally have been dominated by public sector. And energy is a good example. We track 204 private sector generation projects totaling 25 gigawatts of generation investments, right? That's real generation investments where we've seen 5,000 of that already come on stream. So that's quite a bit of megawatts done by the private sector. There's no off-take from Eskom. There's no sovereign guarantee underwriting that. That's purely going into the capital markets, raising the capital for building your generation plant, and then dealing with all the compliance matters, including the fact that you can move your electrons across the transmission grid. So those are important. Similarly, we'll see that in logistics happening. So I thought those two dynamic stuff is quite important, and they kind Fundia, being economists, is like, you talk about these things happen in the long run, but in this instance, they happen quite short. Because if you are persistent, you create the momentum, you create the certainty, you see the benefits immediately. And so it's not just a theoretical issue, but in actual fact, those two elements I think important. Cheaper borrowing costs, certainty, and secondly, that risk being shifted to the private sector where they're able to invest and grow the economy.
Yeah. So on the policy certainty, I think it's quite important in terms of pricing of assets, and I'll ask Fundi the question just now. But could you perhaps touch on the Eskom unbundling, because
Yes.
that really is the biggest lever that can unlock the capital markets. Where are we on that in terms of?
Why do you want to get me into trouble? Okay, so let's start off by last week, right? And the president will close the debate today, later this afternoon. But I thought we've taken a clear policy stance on this, right? That what we set out in the roadmap around unbundling is, firstly, the separation of transmission and the rest, right? Which is both generation and distribution. And that is important, but number one, firstly, you want to create a competitive generation market, so you need an independent system operator to be able to do that. And that's the function of a TSO, transmission system operator, under the broader functions of a national transmission company in South Africa. You need to buy electrons on the market, so we've got to start, and we through the process of finalizing a market code and market conditions. Sorry, I'm not going to go into those details. And then, of course, every single generator, including Eskom, has to compete on that market.
Yes.
And market works on, number one, first price. That's important. So cheap electricity that's passed on to consumers. And secondly, of course, stability in the system. So you've got to balance it, right? So you've got to have not everything renewables, but you've got to have different aspects of technology that is going to feed into that. But that requires for us to have a separate, fully separate and independent transmission system operator. And that's fundamental. Because any risk or any indication that that's not there, incumbents tend to want to dominate it, and they probably will, but you've got to have strong, independence and regulators that are in place. So we're moving ahead. We've already, in the process of setting up what the president announced, a task team to be able to do that. And we've got to deal with this. It's a complex thing because, there are concerns about how we manage this, right? And it's important that, firstly, when we deal with the matter, that we not pass on any financial risk to the entity, the National Transmission System, and the two entities, which is the National Transmission Company of South Africa and Eskom Holdings. Yeah. And thirdly, that we don't pass an additional risk onto the sovereign. Now, I would have to find out how we're going to fund some of these things, because some of it will probably have to be paid by the sovereign. But I don't want to preempt any of this. This is conversations that would happen confidentially. We'll have to get the right sort of experts in. But ultimately, what we want to do is create a competitive generation market. And that's important. The second phase is, of course, the distribution, and that's a complex matter. But we've got to deal with that as well. And there's a couple of things that are already been discussed and decided upon. And the minister has made it fairly clear around some of the interventions that are important. So we're looking at a really, really interesting situation. By the way, we're just laggards in this, right? 110 or 115 countries have already done this reform. We're slow, and we took a policy decision in 1998, never implemented it, or tried unsuccessfully, so we've gotten much further. And so if you take a 100-meter sprint, we're sort of like 80 meters away now. Before we were sort of less than 50 meters. So we're always there, and we almost crossed that threshold. So it's important to measure that in the way that we've done that. The Schedule 2 in 2022 was an important step change that allows you to build your own private generation capacity and also wheel it to customers across the grid without Eskom buying those electrons. That's fundamental. So we're never going to go back to anything else again.
So you're 20 meters in, and next time I'll ask you about the dates. Fundi, in terms of reform, reform is a starting point, and then you've got macro-financial stability as the bridge between reform and asset pricing. How do you think, from a SAP perspective, South Africa is doing on these interconnected themes?
Yeah, so if we look at South African assets, there's some element of discounting that happens when you have policy uncertainty, right? So Rudy was talking about it. If you didn't have electricity, that adds to the discount. So when we think about asset pricing in the South African context, there is the value creation of the company itself, and then you always have the premium that is placed there, the risk premium that's related to the sovereign. You'll have some layering of where inflation is, among other things, right? So where we are in terms of the sweet spot is that inflation is lower. So if we look at just relative pricing in terms of compensation that investors potentially require, that's one plus.
Yeah.
And Rudy is saying he's doing what he's needing to do, and there is movement. And so if we think about the broader pricing of South African assets, the subtraction is there because we don't have the growth realization long term. So if we were to compare ourselves to similar jurisdictions, and what you would do as an investor, you'd look at expected growth outcomes. We get to just below 2% in another 3 years. And that's still a challenge for us. It's the translation of the OV outcomes into actual growth numbers.
Yeah.
The plus is, though, that we are growing at our level of potential at present. And when one talks to a lot of foreign investors, that is a plus for them. It at least looks predictable and things are stabilizing. What investors are looking for right now is, of course, what is going to give you that uptick.
Yes.
And for that, we need to get to benefit realization. There are these promises that have been made, and we're now translating. The second plus we have is, of course, on the government deficit side. Government is now demonstrating that it is stabilizing its debt, so you're not going to get a crowding out of all the money in the market going to government. Two, what Rudy was talking about right now around risk sharing is an important element, because there are now private sector opportunities for sharing. Where I think we are challenged as a jurisdiction, and of course as exchanges, you know about this a lot more than I know, and Astrid might want to say a few more things about this, is around the competitiveness that is that exists in other markets. Now, this is driven by structural shifts in some instances, right? So we still are commodities heavy as a country. And then if we look at, say, our manufacturers and how strong they are in terms of attractiveness, and we look at how investors are sort of pricing South African assets, they sort of look at long-term value. Are these growth outcomes going to be realized? We don't have a Magnificent Seven entity in South Africa. So there are structural components that also affect how we are priced as a jurisdiction. But overall, we are quite attractive, but we do have these gaps that exist because of size, and two, because of changes in composition, because of what South African firms have done to optimize their own operations. So if you end up with secondary listings, you end up having a somewhat different appeal. So there are these structural effects and impacts that are happening that affect how we are considered as a jurisdiction. And Catherine touched on earlier about the change in the composition of investors and what they're looking for, the technological shifts and what is being sought, and also the different drivers of the search for yields at this current conjuncture. So all of these overlays have an impact on the pricing of South African assets. But on the whole, I would say on the macro side, things are looking stable, inflation is lower, and potentially the term premium is influenced by different things.
Yes.
I can't talk about politics, of course, that's a different layer. I'm a central banker, so I stay away from that part.
Great. And of course, the sovereign credit rating does have a role to play
And
in
there's
the,
that,
in the
yes.
asset pricing.
Yeah.
So we spoke about attractiveness and competitiveness. So I'm going to come back to you, Astrid, to say, normally conduct regulation is framed as an investment protection tool. So if we are looking at innovation and also driving competitiveness, how can conduct regulation be seen as a lever for market growth and market efficiency rather than as a constraint? What are the shifts that are required?
I'm not sure that there's necessarily a shift that's required. I think and again, it's something Catherine said earlier, on the one hand, regulation is important for trust, investor confidence. Yes. On the other hand, you need to be careful that you don't over-regulate, because then you constrain innovation. Yeah. So I'm not sure where the sweet spot is, and I don't think there's one that you could say, because each jurisdiction is different. So we need to be cognizant of the South African environment, our own conditions, but also where we fit in globally. So I think conduct regulation is very important because it's ultimately, I think, investor perceptions of fairness, yeah, of transparency, of accountability that create that trust. And those things are really important for deep and liquid financial markets. So I think that's where the conduct regulatory piece comes in. It's about ensuring that information flows can be trusted, that the trading environment is predictable, and ultimately that people can have confidence in the integrity in the market. I just want to make another point, which is that, of course, as the FSCA, we are a securities regulator, as Fundi said, but we're not the only regulator in the market, and the JSE plays an important role. So the JSE's role in terms of market surveillance, those are all very important pieces. Where the FSCA should probably come in is when we talk about cross-market kind of surveillance.
Thank you. I'm going to pause right there for questions from the floor. If you could wait for a mic to reach you before you actually speak. Are there any questions so far for the panel? The lights are so bright here, you can't see. There's a gentleman there on the left.
Good morning. Kobus Esterhuizen from Perisec. Mm-hmm. Opportunistically using the opportunity while we have multiple regulators in one room. The aim to optimize regulation, there's a few issues, and I'll start with the easy one. Due to 200 years of financial markets in South Africa, we still have legacy that creates lots of friction in modern markets. Mm-hmm. Using a few simple examples, security transfer tax, and multiple others. My question is, firstly, on regulation, is there a space to split for smaller startup innovation with a regulation light environment? I just find that it actually embeds large companies to be competitive and crowd out innovation, because to step in financial markets with this type of regulation, I find it extremely difficult for smaller companies. So that's the first question. And I think just maybe a little bit of an opportunistic call out. We talk about certainty in policy, and one big issue that has been very pertinent in our market is uncertainty of tax within collective investment schemes. And it doesn't seem as if there's a conscious, continuous attention to this issue. And to get certainty, I think, is probably more important than anything else. Exactly as you've described, in a world of uncertainty, people step back due to risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobus. I think the first question will be for Astrid.
Just to say, I'm not a regulator, right?
And today you are a regulator, so I'm going to ask you all the questions as well, Rudy. And the second one, if Fundi, you are able to take the tax for collective schemes question. Over to you, Astrid.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, that's the question we often get, and it is very much about a proportional regulatory framework. What we have in place is something called a regulatory sandbox. It's done jointly with the South African Reserve Bank, so the IFWG. I always forget what it's called, what it stands for. But so there is a process through which you can apply to, I suppose, test a product, so that you're not subject to the full, scope of the regulation. Other than that, I think, it's certainly from our side, there's a lot of thinking happening internally around how does one translate regulatory requirements into more proportional regulation. So I think, if you compare South Africa to Europe, the regulation's probably lighter here and more proportional to our environment.
Yes, so maybe just to add, Kobus, I think just globally the practice of sandboxing is one that is just embraced by regulators and central banks all around, because it is in the sandbox that we understand the impacts of what we're doing. So generally you would put regulations in place for extreme cases, right? So you want to be sure that the system is safe and that there's clear accountability and disclosure and risk management. And how you do that might differ per institution depending on what it is that they're doing. So sandboxing is certainly helping us. Now, issues of taxation are very difficult and contentious. So I'm not the tax authority as I sit here. And the approach that we've taken, both the FSCA and ourselves, is we have heard the concerns from the collective investment schemes. We have escalated to the Treasury as the policymaker, but SARS is the one that's responsible for that decision making. And so it becomes very difficult. We can't impose on SARS because SARS will say it's on an entity by entity basis, and this is what I'm giving effect to. So the second we cross that line, us, then SARS crosses into our world. So that's the difficulty, Kobus. That's why I can't sit here and give you an answer, but we hear you still, that still this has not received attention. So when next we meet up with SARS, we will take this up with them again.
Thank you very much, Fundi. I think I'm going to go to a question for all of you in terms of what your expectations are from stakeholders. And Astrid, I'll start with you. What would your message be to boards, intermediaries, and asset managers around behaviors or practices that need to change if we're serious about long-term market health?
So, I think what's very important for boards and of course intermediaries is that they move away from a tick box compliance approach to more of an outcomes-based approach or culture. And that means very much strengthening governance around conflicts of interest, incentives and remuneration, because these ultimately shape conduct and fairness. I think it's also important to invest in data integrity and operational resilience, points I think Fundi made earlier. And, embedding evidence-based disclosure, particularly when it comes to complex products and things like ESG. So, you know, ultimately, the success of our markets depends on a shared responsibility and accountability. On the one hand, as regulators, we put the rules in place, but it's industry behavior that really determines how credible those regulations are.
Just on ESG, how is the FSCA addressing this in terms of disclosures and just making sure that there's no greenwashing that's happening?
So our approach has been to say there's a value chain when it comes to disclosure, and it starts with companies and the disclosures they make. So we're part of a broader process in the country to work on the adoption of the IFRS standards, the ISSB standards, both S1 and S2. And there's a roadmap process that we're busy with. We're not the only ones involved, because our view is that the climate impacts, the disclosures around those aren't only for listed companies to be disclosed. We've got some very large privately held companies that should also be part of the disclosure. And for that reason, we think that that company law is a very good vehicle for it. However, I think we can't get away from the fact that it's probably primarily the largest listed entities that are going to have to disclose. And so, you know, we're working closely with the JSE on ensuring that.
Great, thank you. Rudy, in terms of Operation Vulindlela 2.0, maybe you can touch a bit on that and how the people in this room can actually help turning those reform plans into impact. I know that PPPs have worked quite well with the first version, but what can we look forward to, and what are your expectations from the people in this room for the second phase?
I mean, I think a lot more of private sector investment. I mean, it's quite interesting because, you know, the biggest risk, I think, or sort of the biggest uncertainty in many of the capital markets and the banks or institutional investors is information asymmetry. Right? So they don't quite know or understand policy sufficiently enough. I mean, what has happened quite nicely is that 2 or 3 of the major banks have reached out to us and said, listen, can you come and speak to our capital allocation committees? Right? So we understand exactly the sort of risks, where we are with the policy, what decision choices you're going to make around timeframes. And I think that's really useful, right? That you're able to make decisions, able to allocate capital to private sector, and I think that's an important. So what you're going to see quite significantly so is massive investments that will continue to flow through, and we think probably about 400 to 450 to about 550 billion rand of investments still have to flow through the system for generation. Probably half of that for logistics in this year. Quite exciting because, of course, many of the potential private sector participants that would participate when we do announce the RFPs, as in the Vulindlela plan, which is by June, for those 3 lines are going to be important. They're going to come to you and say, well, look, this looks bankable, or you determine the bankability of it, and we want to support you. Similarly, in the water and the reforms in the water and the electricity distribution, and of course the ring fencing there is quite an important part, which is critical for us around ensuring that we do get service delivery. So the Metro Trading Services reform as an incentive program to ring fence both water and distribution, water and electricity distribution, is an important part of distributors coming back into the capital markets again to borrow for maintenance and capex spend, and I think these are going to be. So it's quite I think it's quite an exciting time for the capital markets. Just write the checks. That's all we need at the end of the day, right? You know, if you don't trust us, at least trust your colleagues in the private sector to do the investments, okay? And that's the market discipline that's there, right? And I think that's an important part. So, yeah.
I think in the future we'll be coming to talk to you about water coming from Gauteng in terms of the infrastructure development.
Absolutely.
Because we can't all shower at the Hilton. So Fundi, if you had one ask of market participants in this room, what would you say we should start doing differently to support deeper and more resilient capital markets?
So one ask, sure. mean, I think what the JSE has been endeavoring to do over the past few years has been important, which is talking to government and to the regulators in an organized way. I think I spoke earlier about the importance of sandboxing. We all know what the problems are. So we've got to aggregate that information and say very clearly, this is not working.
Yes.
So the presidency is hosting an investment conference at the end of March. So that aggregation, so there are things that are not working in metros. We need to make sure that this is happening.
Yeah.
We are seeing initiatives such as Operation Pumelela, which is just talking about these financial center type reforms, right, that are going to strengthen us. And I think that the realization among participants that there's not going to be a big bang to reform. So it's all modular now because we have learned. We can't do big bang in the country. So we've got to do these modular reforms. We started a conversation around a new inflation target. It got delivered. Rudy and them and Ernest have been making sure that there is electricity. We have electricity. There's reform on the transport side. So it's all of the micro elements that will eventually bring us to the whole. But there are things that we've got to organize better around in order to do joint problem solving. Also joint problem solving around opportunities that you see. We were talking about ESG earlier. There are opportunities there because funding is going to follow different types of projects going forward.
Yes.
And as part of our G20 presidency, we were having these conversations last year around if we think about climate mitigation strategies or adaptation, what can we do as joint PPP type programs, right, as vehicles for funding? And what is the risk sharing that can be proportionate? Because this is a risk that we know is coming through and we're dealing with it right now in some provinces of the country. But it's also an investment opportunity for yourself. So, but we need to have these different conversations together because there are some things that we don't see that you see as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Fundi. I think our time is up. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us. And I suppose the key message is that in a system where risk is moving faster than regulation, what becomes important to drive stability is the coherence between macro policy, reforms, conduct regulation, and also the contribution of the people in this room. And with that, I'd like to thank you all.